Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another edition of the All Out Leadership Podcast. This is the right message heading into the Christmas season. You're probably dreading some of those difficult relationships that you have to face, some very ungodly family members that seem to mock you, mock your faith, mock your Christianity. And so this is going to be very timely for so many, but we're all going to get something from this. Last week we looked at the story of Mephibosheth and how David gave him what he didn't deserve. He was lame. He came from nothingness. He was living in shame. But David had him sit at his table continually. And that's what we're called as believers, to sit at a table of communion, a table of grace that we didn't deserve. And what happens right after this is, I believe there's no coincidence in the Bible. And when you're reading a chapter, you want to kind of look at what came before it, what came after it. Because often what we'll see is God's giving us contrasts. God often contrasts things to help highlight stories. So when Jesus gave the story of the prodigal son, it's really a story of contrast. There's two types of kids, and we learn a lot about ourselves in the midst of contrast. So what we see is one person who was poor, broke, and destitute respond to the grace. And what we see in this chapter is someone who was rich and powerful and famous actually reject the grace of Jesus when they rejected the grace of Christ. So 2 Samuel chapter 10, we're going to pick up. Now it happened after this that the king of the people of Ammon died, and Hanun, his son, reigned in his place. Then David said, I'll show kindness to Hanun as his father showed kindness to me. And that's the Jesus we serve. He wants to show us kindness. So how does Jesus show a world kindness? Well, he sends messengers. And so that's what we see. 2 Samuel chapter 10, verse 2. So David sent by the hand of his servants to comfort him concerning his father. And David's servants came into the land of the people of Ammon. You and I are the messengers of Jesus to go bring comfort, to bring messages of grace to a world that's suffering, to a world that's hurting. Now, the messenger sent to Mephibosheth received that message of grace. There are going to be some messengers that aren't received, that are rejected, and that's what we see as we continue this story. Not everybody's going to accept you. Not everybody's going to go, oh, that's great, you're a Christian. Oh, that's great that you found Jesus. Oh, great, you invited me to church. Not everybody's going to respond that way. How do we handle the rejection from a little bit of a violent world? 2 Samuel chapter 10, verse 3. And the princes of the people of Ammon said to Hanun, their lord, do you think that David really honors your father because he has sent comforters to you? Has David not rather sent his servants to you to search the city, to spy it out, to overthrow it? And therefore Hanun took David's servants, shaved off half their beards, cut off their garments in the middle at their buttocks, and sent them away. I love the Bible. It's just funny. It just puts all these kind of like inappropriate stories in there just to shock and awe us. And so get a picture of this. So these guys don't trust the motives of David's servants. And you know what? We get that all the time. Oh, the church is just after your money, or the church is just a bunch of crooks, or the church da-da-da-da. Here's why people do that. If you can discredit the messengers, then you've discredited the message. Look, they're really not upset with you as much as they're just finding an excuse to not have to listen to the message of grace, so they don't have to be accountable to the King of Grace. So what they do is they take these guys and they shave off half their beard. Now, in the Jewish culture, the beard represented masculinity. And so they were really emasculating these men and humiliating them in public. Pretty much just like junior high, when you get thrown out of the locker room with a wedgie, or thrown out with no clothes on. Not that ever happened to me. Anyway, so it's humiliating. And that's what these guys are doing. They're really just trying to humiliate them. Then they cut them off at the pants, basically, and send them back naked with their backsides being exposed to the world. Again, they're just humiliating them. So how do we respond when people cut you down? How do you respond when people attack you? When people begin to try to emasculate you and undermine you? Again, if they can discredit you, then they can discredit the messenger. First of all, look, don't take it personal. They're not really upset with you. They're just upset with God. They're really upset with Jesus. They're just taking it out on you, just like this man took it out on David's servants. There are people who will just take it out on you. And it does make a difference in handling rejection when you realize it's not personal. It's really them and God, and that's the battle. And I've been rejected so many times in 37 years of sharing Christ in my school, in Berkeley University campuses, and I mean, all over. And as a Christ follower for 37 years, I've experienced some pretty intense mocking, some pretty intense cut downs. And I just remind myself, look, they're not angry at me. They're really just angry at God. 2 Samuel chapter 10, verse 4. And when they told David, he sent to meet them because the men were greatly ashamed. And then the king said, wait at Jericho until your beards have grown and then return. I love that David cared that his servants were cut down. I love that David actually took compassion on his servants. Know this, that when people reject you, Jesus sees it. In fact, Jesus said, rejoice when men persecute you, when they revile you and say all kinds of evils against you, for great is your reward in heaven. Jesus is going to reward you for sharing your faith. He doesn't reward you for the results. He rewards you that you just obeyed. You can't produce results. That's God's job. He rewards you for sowing your seeds of the gospel. He rewards you for shining your light. And I'm just so glad that we get rewarded not on results, but on obedience. So David had compassion on his servants. Now it's interesting. He says, hey, wait at Jericho until your beards have grown and then return. Why Jericho? What's the significance of that? He could have said any city in Israel. Why Jericho? Well, Jericho had significance for a couple things. Number one, the priests and Levites lived in Jericho. So remember the parable of the Good Samaritan? Highlights that a Levite was coming down from Jerusalem down to Jericho. A priest came down from Jerusalem to go down to Jericho. Why? They would live in Jericho. They would go up to Jerusalem for their time of ministering in the temple. Then they would come back. Jericho is where the priests and the Levites lived. It's a picture of God's house. So here's what David is saying. Hey, stay with God's people. When you're suffering and when you're persecuted, what you need are the people of God. You need to surround yourself with people that get it. Surround yourself with people of like faith. Look, when you're going through difficult times, hang out with some godly brothers, godly sisters, get into your small group, connect with your church. It's so important that you're surrounded by biblical community, and that's what David is doing here. And here's what's going to happen. When you get back into biblical community, you're going to grow again. You're going to get back to where you were when maybe somebody cut you down and hurt you. What happens in the rest of the story? Well, David goes out and actually fights the enemy. That tells us that you don't need to go out and go on a rampage. You don't need to go John Wick on your adversaries. Let Jesus defend you. Romans chapter 12, verse 18, verse 20 says, if at all possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Blessed are the peacemakers, not the peacekeepers. There are times you can't keep peace, but you can do your part to help make peace as much as depends on you. And you know what? Not all men are peaceable, and you can't have peace with everybody. You can't have peace with terrorists, but there are times, you know what? I just do my part. There's relational terrorists. There's people who they're just challenging. You do your part to be peaceable, and then what do? You trust God to do what you can't do. You need healthy boundaries. Nothing wrong with that. But you still want to continue to be a light. So Paul continues, beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap coals of fire on his head. I love that verse. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And I got a long list for Jesus. And I'm often reminding him, okay, Lord, I haven't seen any vengeance yet. Vindicate me. And God's very slow on that list, by the way. Why? Because he's more interested in their salvation, and he's more interested in them being changed or healed or made better from whatever it is issue that they have. So Jesus says, pray for them, feed them, give them water. And here's what happens. He likens it unto heaping coals of fire on their head. Why? I'm like, oh, that's awesome. Lord's going to burn them up. Well, that's actually not the biblical context. See, in this day and age, to heap coals on one's head, it was a different picture. It wasn't a picture of burning someone up. In that day and age, they didn't have electric stoves. They didn't have a gas stove for cooking. They used hot coals. Well, at times, coals would go out, and it was very difficult to rekindle their fires. So what the women would do, they would go to a neighbor with a jar, and they would ask for one of their coals. The neighbor would take one of those hot coals, put it in that jar. The woman would carry that on her head back to their home. And you'll see that in even cultures today where men, women, they'll carry jars on their head, and it just helps distribute the weight. That's the picture here, because it would rekindle the fire inside of their home. Here's what God's telling us. When you allow God to fight for you, when you allow God to fight your battles, and you continue to pray, you continue to do good to those that persecute you and spitefully use you, it's like a fiery coal that brings back to rekindle the right fire inside of their home. How do we get lost people fired up for God? How do we get burned out Christians rekindled for the love of God and the things of God? You do good to them. You trust Jesus to do what he needs to do, and God will heap coals of fire on their head. Why? Not to burn them up, not to burn them out, but to rekindle a walk with God. So that's how we deal with rejection.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.